Mary Ellen Carsley is a scientific and botanical illustrator, as well as an art educator. A former practicing architect, she has illustrated 8 books and numerous articles for national and international journals. Her works have been included in the collections of the National Building Museum and the Library of Congress. She's a member of the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators, Maryland Federation of Art, the Art League at the Torpedo Factory, Washington Calligraphers Guild, and the Guild of Bookworkers. We're very excited to have Mary Ellen here today to teach us about basic watercolor with summer flowers. So with that, over to you, Mary Ellen.
Thank you so much, Libby, and welcome to all of you to my home studio here. And I'm excited that you could join us today. And for those of you who are coming back again, have taken class with me before, thank you so much for choosing to come back. I really appreciate that. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about watercolor fundamentals. But so for now, what I'm going to talk about a little bit is I'm going to switch my camera and I'm going to talk to you about the basic materials as well as preparing that underdrawing. So I'll switch cameras here so you won't see me anymore. Nothing's wrong with your screen. You're going to be looking at my desktop. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you'll be able to see. I have a standard watercolor palette here. This palette, when you buy it, it comes empty. I have a messy palette, so but I look at all of the washes that I have here as sort of notes for paintings that I'm working on or paintings that I've recently completed. For myself, I usually use Winsor Newton brand. This isn't meant as kind of a paid endorsement or anything like that. And they're just the colors that seem to work best for me, as well as Holbein colors. And I have my own palette where I've chosen the colors myself. You can see on my website more advice about how to build your palette. The basic brushes that we're going to be using today, and I'll zoom down just a little bit, is this is called a round brush. This is a sable brush, and it's a number 6 size. You can see the size of the tip relative to my hand. Other brushes that are very, very handy to have are an inch wide flat or bright brush, as well as a detailed brush. And occasionally, folks like to have a bright that has an angled tip on it. But today, all of the painting that we're going to be doing, these are the ones that you want to have for basics drawing or for basic watercolor, and you want to have these handy. But for what we're going to be using today, we're going to do everything with a number 6 bright. Okay, so this is generally the size of the brush that comes with a watercolor kit. So if you've bought pan watercolors, that's great. Those will work just perfect for today. And the brush that you have is going to be just fine. In looking for a good brush, you always want to make sure that when your brush gets wet, that there aren't any stray hairs, and that it always comes together in a nice sharp tip like this one does. Now, the paper that we have today is, I'm using 90-pound Strathmore paper. I actually am painting on postcards. I really, really enjoy painting on postcards, and I buy packs of this paper in a watercolor block it comes in. And then what I like to do is the 90-pound paper tends to be thick enough, and that 90 pounds refers to the thickness of the paper itself. Okay, I find that thinner than this, the paper tends to buckle. That means it gets little hills and valleys in it when it gets wet. And in order to avoid that, you can either leave it in the watercolor block, or you can do, as you see, as I have here on my drawing board today, I've taped my blocks down and the samples that I'm going to be doing for you today with painter's tape. This is standard painter's tape that I get from Ace Hardware. So there's nothing magic about this. The wonderful thing about the painter's tape is that it doesn't damage the paper when I take it up. And it also keeps a nice crisp edge for if I were to take a wash all the way to the end of the page here. So generally I protect my pages with just a regular piece of trace paper. When I'm doing this, the reason I do this means if you have to set your hand down, if you have a larger piece of paper, or if you're working on multiples like I am here today, this avoids you putting your hand down on the page itself and potentially making an oily mark. We all have natural oils in our hands, and we know that oil and water don't mix. And of course, our paint is watercolor, so we don't want to have the watercolor have to try to compete with any oils that are on the page. So we keep the tracing paper there to set the heel of our hand on if we feel like you need to set it down, and have that handy. You'll notice too that I keep a piece of watercolor paper. I keep an extra piece handy at all times. This is so that I can, and it's this exact same paper that I have that I am painting on. This way I can do little daubs of color. I can experiment. This is basically my scrap paper. So I like to leave this nearby my palette so I can also adjust the amount of fluid that I have in my brush as well as the amount of pigment. And we're going to talk more about that as time goes on. This is what we're going to be doing today. This is the finished product, our zinnia flower. But I'm also, for those of you who chose the rose mallow and the vinca, okay, I'll be working on those as well so that we can talk a little more about the techniques, a variety of techniques that we use in watercolor. Okay, so I'm going to leave it right there for a moment. And Libby, I'm going to ask you, do we have any questions right now?
Not at present. So if you'd like to, go ahead and jump into to painting. Let's do this thing.
Okay, sounds wonderful. All right, so I've prepared, you can see, and I'm going to pull out just a little bit more with my camera so you can see I have my drawing board all prepared. I have I've already done my pencil drawings, and how I did that was I printed out my template, and it's a very, very straightforward way of doing this. Printed out my template. I made sure that it fits the size of my paper here. And then you might recall this from doing something like this in grade school. I took a soft pencil and I merely created a layer of graphite on the back of the drawing. So I was very careful to make sure that my graphite was behind the drawing, the template that I printed out. And then I carefully taped my watercolor paper with a little piece of painter's tape on the back, flip it over, and with a colored pencil, I begin to trace my drawing. And when I do that, you can see that I get I'll hold it up to the camera so folks can see it. You get a very light ghost of an image, and your graphite acts like the old-fashioned carbon paper, and it works very, very well. It gives you a very, very light image that you can darken up if you want to, but this is a nice, fast way that you can go ahead and trace those drawings and get started in painting. But I encourage you always to practice your drawing and painting. And as I mentioned, if you want to look at fundamentals of drawing, you can do that on my website, and also keep an eye out for when I do another course on the fundamentals of botanic drawing here at the Botanic Gardens. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and we're going to talk about watercolor basic techniques. So this little area that I have already drawn out for us is to explain the basic techniques that we're going to be using. Now, the first technique that you're going to do is a solid wash. And so I have my watercolor, I have my watercolor palette, and I'm going to pull out just a little bit so you can see how I prepare my brush. I have my take my brush. I like to give it a little swish in the water there, wipe off any excess water. If your brush is brand new, you may have noticed that it's quite stiff, and that's because it has starch in it so that the bristles don't get damaged in transit. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to give it a good swish around and then feel the bristles as soon as they're soft and flexible and it doesn't feel like there's any starch residue, then just give it a wipe off on your paper towel right next to that you keep handy next to your water, and then go ahead and begin to activate your color in the pan there. You'll notice that I am rolling my brush as I'm daubing it so that I get the pigment evenly distributed on the edge of the brush. So taking off any excess, I'll set that down. Keep it off here to the side so you can see how I'm working. And then the first thing we're going to do, as I mentioned, is we're going to do a solid wash. So, and you can just practice this on a piece of scrap paper. You don't need to draw out these blocks. You're going to just try to make a very nice, neat rectangle that is all one single shade of the blue or of whatever color that you've chosen. Now, keep in mind that there are three components to paint. There's pigment, which is that which gives it the color. So, and pigments for paint come in a variety, are sourced in a variety of ways. Sometimes they're minerals, sometimes they come from plants, and occasionally they come from animals, such as the cochineal beetle, which is where we get the wings of the cochineal beetle is what gives us a beautiful red, purplish red, alizarin crimson that we associate with Japanese maples in the autumn. Now you'll notice that I was very careful to get the edges and then to distribute the pigment as evenly as I possibly could in there. And this is going to be our solid wash as we're going along. Now, let's talk about doing a graduated wash. Okay, that's going to be our next component there that we're going to do. So move this up here so it's a little bit handier. Again, I'm going to just stick with the same blue that I'm using, and I'm going to begin with a brush that is fully loaded with pigment. Okay, and I'm going to start in that far that far end here, and I'm going to try to get I'm going to try to get the richest hue that I can possibly get. Now at this point, I'm going to stop going back to the palette. And what I did was I'm just going right to the water, dipping my brush in, taking the excess off, and then adding a little bit more water every time. Now, I want you to keep in mind the physics of what you're doing, because remember, I mentioned to you, there's three components. We've got pigment, we've got binder, and in watercolor, the binder is gum arabic, and it is water soluble, which makes sense because that's what we're breaking down when we add water. And so now all of those tiny pigment particles are floating, and we're trying to control the concentration of them across the page. Now, some watercolor papers, you can see I'm getting progressively lighter, and I'm working carefully, and I tend to work to the middle and then get a little slower when I move out towards the edges. And there we go. And we have a nice graduated wash that works from very, very dark to very, very light. And we have a full range of value for this hue. Really good terms to remember. Value is the lightness and darkness of the color, and the name of the color is the hue itself. So it's blue, but we have a very dark blue here and a very light blue on the end. Okay, so now let's talk about Another technique that we can use. So we're gonna get into, at this point, we're gonna talk a little bit about color mixing. We can do this in a couple of ways. I'm gonna load my brush up again, okay, with my blue. It's a little bit heavy, okay, so I'm gonna take my paper towel here, I might pull a little bit of that pigment out. And I'm going to try to make a middle tone blue here in this rectangle. Okay. Looks like I went outside the lines. Uh-oh, that's not good. Try to straighten that out just a little bit there. There we go. All right. So now we've got a nice middle tone blue here that I've done. And one of the great things about watercolor is that it is transparent. So I can actually layer another color on top of that. And I can do that in a couple of different ways. So this way, I'm gonna let this rectangle dry for a minute. And I'm going to show you another way. I'm going to show you two ways that you can actually mix your colors and layer your colors. One of the most common ways we see, and I'm thinking about, I went right for my orange because in my garden right now, it's filled with daylilies, and I'm so thrilled about it. Just absolutely love daylilies. And so what I'm going to do is right over here, I'm going to draw for myself or paint for myself here a daylily, just a petal. And I'm going to have that nice light to dark movement right there. I'm going to let that dry for just a second, but not too long, because the daylilies that I have a lovely interior that's quite dark. So what I'm going to do is, while that was, you probably saw that how that pigment bloomed, and that is in fact the term that you use in watercolor. You get that nice blooming pigment, wet into wet. So that is the first way that we can blend different colors on our watercolor, is working wet into wet and doing that. Now, you'll notice that I'm keeping this edge here. If I have that back side of that petal, and I want to make that a significantly lighter, I can just keep just ever so slightly a little bit of white space. Or I can, if it's dry enough, I can bring it right up to the edge and they can meet. And then I can get the back side of that petal there. And it looks like our little daylily petal there in doing that. Now, the other way we can blend colors is, as I mentioned, is by layering them. And so what we can do is, I'm going to layer my blue here. Now that it's dry, I can feel it with the back. You'll notice I felt it with the back of my finger. You tend to have less oils on the back of your hand. So if you want to check the dryness of something, you can just check with the back of your hand or the back of your finger. And then I can just layer right on over that blue color with my yellow. And just working very carefully. Notice I don't linger over the blue. We don't want to reactivate the blue pigment. So I'm not lingering over that. And notice how we can get a really nice effect of transparency here. Also, this kind of technique works super well when we're trying to capture a cast shadow. When one part of a flower is casting a shadow onto a leaf or onto another petal. So this works really well. But if we wanted to really enhance the fact that it was a different color, that we wanted to have this sort of blue and yellow mix into a green, then we could actually just wait for this to dry a little bit and then just touch it with the green pigment. And then we really get a strong sense of that overlap. Oh, it's starting to bloom a little bit into there. I might pull just a little bit of that out. It's going to be a really, this is called lifting. I'm going to show you a little bit more how you lift. Helps you control that. So we've got a solid wash. Okay, 2 solid washes here. We've got our graduated wash here from dark to light. We've explored wet into wet, and then we've also explored dry to dry layering of the color. Now, the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to create some movement, some value movement. And one of the things that I want you to keep in mind is that always, whenever you're painting or drawing, try to simplify what you're doing. See the big basic shapes of the shadows, of the forms, and focus just on those basic shapes. Don't get caught down in all the fiddly bits. Try to see, that a flower is essentially round, that it is essentially a triangular shape, and work with it from there, and then move on into the details. The same is true with trying to capture the values in here. So if I'm going to paint this sphere and I want to create the illusion that it is 3-dimensional on a 2-dimensional surface, I'm going to need another tool. I'm going to need the tool of value. I'm going to have to use that. Now, my values, I can make darker or lighter blues, but if I wanted to make a shadow that looked correct on the blue, you have to think about your color theory, and you're going to think about the opposite. And your opposite color to blue is orange. So I'm going to go over here in my palette. I'm going to actually pick up a little bit of orange, and I'm going to blend it. I'm going to just blend it a little bit here on my palette, and I'm going to come up with a very, very dark blue. Notice that the orange disappears. I shouldn't be seeing orange. I should just be seeing a dark blue, and I come in and look at that dark value. I can get onto that. It's really kind of wonderful. And this is why you do not need to use black, almost never. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm taking a clean brush and I'm pulling out the highlight. This is called lifting. Remember, your brush can act in 2 ways. It can act to put like a mop where we put water down, but it can also act like a sponge when we pick up the color. And look at that, we're getting that wonderful glassy technique. This is where our highlight is. This is the side that's facing the light. Generally for right-handed folks, we're gonna have that facing, we're gonna have that the light source from the upper left-hand corner. And then we have our turning shadow. This is the point when the sphere turns away, or the form is turning away from the light source. That tends to be our darkest value. And so I know it seems counterintuitive. It seems like the part of the sphere that would be furthest away would be the darkest part, but that's not the case. This part over here that's furthest away, I'm actually going to lift out a little bit, because this is what's called the reflected light. And this is the light that's bouncing off of the ground and back on to the form that you're painting. Now, it doesn't matter if you're painting a flower or you're painting a portrait. This lighting scenario is always the same. You're always going to have a highlight, a turning shadow, and a reflected light. Notice that the reflected light is lighter, but not as light as the highlight. Last but not least, the shadow that we always have to keep our eyes open for is the cast shadow. And this is the shadow that the object is casting either onto the ground plane or onto an object that's nearby. And you're going to notice that it tends to be elongated depending on the angle of the light source. So it's an elongated shape of the form that you're drawing or that you're painting. And it's also a graduated wash. It's darkest closest to the object, and then it fades as it gets to the edges. You can see this in wintertime really well if you look at your own cast shadow on the sidewalk. It's very, very, the edges are tight and it's very dark, closest to your body. And then as your shadow extends along the sidewalk, it gets much less dark. And then the edges get a lot softer. And so now we have this, by using a range of values that we enhance by using the opposite color with whatever our local color is, we're able to create that illusion of form, that 3D sense of 3D on a 2D surface. Lots of fun. Now, one of the things too that I want you to notice, this sort of, again, this kind of counterintuitive idea of blending the opposite color with their local color that you're using, is that if you look around, you're going to notice, and as you look around your world, you're going to notice there's very, very little complete black, like just solid black. We don't see that very, very often. And the shadows that we see contain other colors that are reflected from around us. So this kind of warmth and liveliness is much more true to our actual experience of sight than just doing a flat black shape onto that. So you will actually notice that I do not have black on my palette. And if you're noticing that, that's not black, that's actually a dark umber. So that's so I don't even keep it on my palette. If I want black, I simply mix my primaries and then put in a lot of blue, and I work that way. Now, it might be a little bit overwhelming at first when you start thinking about painting, about all of this color theory, but I assure you it comes with practice. And I can't encourage you enough. There is no substitute for practice. So there's our basic materials, okay? And there are our basic techniques, and I'll do a little close-up. So
yeah, I was going to ask you, Marilyn, if you could just zoom in there and just leave it for a second without kind of moving your hands around in it, so people can get a really nice clear view. And then while you're doing that, we did have one question come in. This person wanted to know if they could use watercolor pencils as well as like the palette watercolors for this.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Watercolor pencils, actually, to tell you the truth, if you're a little bit intimidated about watercolor, I encourage you to use watercolor pencils because it's a little bit slower process. And because of that, you get a chance to sort of think, and it's not quite as intimidating. Like you're just, like, oh, now I've just completely messed it up. And because watercolor is what I call a hurry up and wait medium, because you often have to work quickly and then you have to stop and wait for it to dry a little bit. And then you go in and you work quickly and then you have to stop and wait again. With watercolor pencil, you don't have to do that. You can just keep the process slow and steady and building up that way. But the color theory with watercolor pencil is identical to using tube or pan watercolors. If I want to get that contrast, if I want to get that deep value, I'm going to use the opposite color and blend it with my local color. And you can do that with the watercolor pencil. So any other questions?
Yes. How wet should the brush be when you're using it, and how do you balance that? So this person's having trouble with all their colors kind of coming out the same shade.
Oh, okay. So that is a great exercise for that is, and I'm gonna pull out just a little bit so I have a little bit more room here. So you can still see the example that I did, but I'm gonna put my scrap piece up here. So what that's gonna help you, what's gonna help is doing a little bit of practice on your scrap paper. So take your brush and let me pull it out a little bit more so you can actually see my palette and my and how I'm handling the water. And I'm going to keep my paper towel handy, okay? Right now, the brush is super soppy, okay? Very, very wet, fully loaded with water. I use that when I'm going right to a dry pigment that's in my watercolor pan. I'm just activating the color now. And notice once again, you're gonna notice that brush, I'm actually rolling it between my fingers, and I'll pull over just a little bit here. So I'm rolling it between my fingers as I'm activating that. Now, that's gonna be very, very wet, very, very dark, okay? I'm gonna get the richest pigment that I can from that. Now, if I want to, and that might be, and if it's really wet, that's going to be a lot to control. You can see right, and I'll zoom down in here so you can see. This is a very, very intense color, okay? And it's very, very wet right now, okay? I'm going to have to let that sit for a little bit, because if I go into that and do anything, unless I do it on purpose, I can come in, I can lift. My brush is very dry. Notice that I cleaned the brush, took almost all the water out of it, and then I could lift that out. So I would say practice doing things like that. And then also practice dipping in, just clean brush now. Take a little bit off of the, let me pull out again so you can see how I'm manipulating the brush between the palette and the paper. So dipping it in, take one little swipe, come here, and seeing what that feels like on there. Now maybe I even want to experiment a little and see how to get that graduated wash going. Maybe I come back, but these kinds of little exercises where I'm trying to do graduated washes, I'm trying to make little marbles, is going to help you a great deal in learning how to adjust the pigment to water ratio on there. And when in doubt, keep it light and don't feel like you have to have, a wet mop that you're gonna be working on a dirty floor with. You can just keep it really, you don't need as much water as you think you do. And even at this point where this is all kind of wobbly, I can still come in here and manipulate that edge, round that off. And I would just practice on pages like this. Then there's also some lovely effects you can get too by, and you'll notice that actually happened over here with, I happened to come by with my brush at the end and it had a lot of water in it. And when I did this, and it got this beautiful blooming, so it's no longer a solid, it's no longer a solid rectangle with the wash, but I got this beautiful blooming technique. And I saw that happening and I thought, oh, while I was demoing, I thought maybe I should fix that. And then I thought, no, I'll leave that because I'll come back to it. So the person's question was really timely. You can just experiment on your scrap piece of paper, and notice too that as you're experimenting with the water to paint ratio, and you can control that, as I said, by daubing on your paper towel there, while you're doing those experiments, notice these lovely effects that you can get, especially for for botanical subjects, these can be very, very handy to have that to work with, because you can get these wonderful edges like this. You can get these beautiful broken up that looks like those irregularities of leaf venation. All of those kinds of things can be helpful to you. So take note of these little experiments. And remember, as I said, I'm using postcards today. These are super inexpensive. And the paper has a medium tooth on it. And when I say tooth, that refers to the texture of the paper. So it's not too slick and it's not too bumpy. It has a little bit of texture to it, but not a lot. So that's usually what they refer to as cold press paper, which means that when the paper was made, it went through the last pressing, the rollers, just like it's like going over fabric with a cold iron. It sort of irons it out, but not completely. If I get hot press paper, that means it went through with a hot iron, and you'll notice that hot press paper is always a lot slicker and smoother. As you get more experience with watercolor, you will change the different kinds of paper textures that you use, because these basic techniques, they will behave differently on hot press paper or on cold press paper. And you can make that selection depending on your subject. So if I'm going to paint, say, a portion of a bonsai that is a Japanese black pine, and it has a very, very rough bark texture, then I probably want to get a technique like this, but it would be even more enhanced if this paper texture was rougher. So those are the kinds of things that you're going to weigh as you go back and as you paint more and more. Okay, so Libby, any more questions?
I think you already spoke to this, but just if you could really quickly just hit on it, and then we'll jump into another segment of your painting here.
Sure.
But what happens if you make an area too dark? Is there a way to kind of lighten it?
Oh yeah, now that's the lifting. That's exactly. So I can just go over that one more time. That's so if I have an area, and let me find something that's really commitment here. I will take this sort of deep purple here. I'm going to get, and say that I come in and, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with that? That's a lot of pigment right there. Well, going to take my brush, get all the pigment out. I took a little bit, just a little bit of the water out. And now I'm going to come in, I'm going to pull up just ever so gently. The reason I did that first is because I want to get some movement first, not necessarily making a highlight. But you can see how I lifted that out. And notice too how I use the brush, how I'm holding the brush sometimes. And in this case, I'm actually going to come in with the brush. I'm holding it almost straight up like this. So I'm using the tip of the brush, and I'm going to pull out, really lift out, and I'm actually twisting so I can get a line there. And we can manipulate, that petal. So there we go. Ooh, I like that. Orchids have these wonderful sort of tongues, and you can use your brush, and especially orchid petals, small leaves, you can use your brush in ways that, and this is actually, I need to give credit where credit is due. Using my brush more thoughtfully and creatively is something that I learned from practicing Chinese painting techniques. So this brush, I can get a very wide line. Okay, I can go like that and go right across like that. But then as I lift it up, look at that, I can get, so as I move it, I can get, that was just one stroke. And then I also can use just the end of it, and look at that. It's hard to believe that, and I'll bring this down just for a moment. It's hard to believe that this and this are from the same brush. So if you really learn how to use your brush and get very practiced at it, you can really get a lot out of one brush. If I do something like that. And then also too, don't be afraid of, look at how that broke up. And I'll bring the camera down. This is lovely how there's like a breakup here for a highlight. It's a little bit deeper here. You can imagine that maybe this attaches to a stem. And then you start to get the little connection in here, and it really starts to come alive. So using that brush in all the ways and not being afraid of, straight up and down, tilting it on its side, pressing down, thinking about the pressure that you use. Also, notice too, like this is another thing that also, I think I probably learned this more in calligraphy, is when you think about how you could come up and then a little flourish at the end like that. You come up and a little flourish at the end like that. So have little scrap paper, try it out to begin to understand how the paint behaves with the water, and how to control that between the balance of the pigment with the water, and then also how to get the most out of your brush. Use it, changing your posture, changing the pressure, all of those things. Sometimes one of the things that with watercolor is I like to think of watercolor like poetry. Poetry has a great deal of meaning with as few words as possible. And I think of watercolor as the same way. You want to have a great deal of visual impact, a great deal of meaning communicated through your painting without having too many brush strokes. You want to keep it as simple as possible. So Libby, I wanted to double check with you that we are okay as far as connectivity.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right.
I'm still here, and we can jump into zinnias.
Okay, so here is my zinnia, and wonderful. And do we have any questions? Just really quickly. I don't want to cut anybody off.
Nope. I think we're good for right now. We'll come back to any that pop up here at our next sort of break point.
Okay, sounds fantastic. Now you will notice, okay, as my drawing board has been moving around here for you to see, those of you who did pick the rose mallow or the vinca, I have them there, and we're going to talk about those in brief. But the zinnia is what we're featuring. This is what we're hoping for today. Okay, so again, little postcard size painting. And I find it a lot less intimidating to work on smaller paintings rather than larger paintings. And so this was the template, okay, that you can download. You may have downloaded for that. And you're going to see that I keep my drawing. It's pretty light. I'm going to zoom in a bit there so you can see it. But it is very, very light. Now, one question that folks ask very, very often is, can I erase after I've painted? You can, but to a limited degree. And when you erase, what I would recommend is that you use a white eraser as opposed to the standard pink eraser. The pink occasionally will be a little too aggressive on a watercolor. So the white tends to be a little gentler, and whatever you pick up at that point is what you pick up, okay? So but I would say do not bear down and really try to erase out lines once you've painted over them, because you have the potential of actually kind of scarring the paper and making the paper pill. You ruin the tooth of the paper when you get those little things that look like they get on your sweater in wintertime. So you don't want that to happen with that at all. Now, when we look at this, when we look at the finished product here, okay, I'm going to keep that just off to the side here. I'm going to have my piece of scrap paper here, okay, handy. I've got my paper towel handy, and right next to me is and I'm actually going to find it a little bit easier to keep it up top here. And then we'll zoom out just a bit. I want to make sure that you can see me pretty well here. And there, perfect. All right. So, and I will zoom in periodically, but I do want you to see how we're going to be getting started here. So I'm going to take my brush, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the largest feature, okay? So in drawing and painting, it's always the same way. I'm going to start with basically the color that covers the most square inches on my painting. So I'm going to start with this with the deep red. It's kind of has a little bit of orange in it. I'm going to mix that up. Notice that I got my brush very wet. I'm activating the color. I'm rotating my brush between my fingers to get a nice even coverage. But notice that I'm carrying some of that color out onto the pan, because I am going to be doing a little bit of mixing with this. So I'm going to get, this is what I like to refer to as the local hue. This is the color that, I dog hair, sorry about that. And it seems they get everywhere. So this is the color that, you know, if you look at a flower, you'd say it's red or it's pink or it's orange. So this is what I refer to as the local color. This is the main color that we're going to be working with. And I mix up a good bunch of it here on my palette, so I have that handy. Now, my brush is fully loaded now with that color. I'm going to thin it out just a little because I don't want to be too bold with it when I come down. So I'm going to just take a little bit of that out, might put it onto there. And now I'm ready to start painting. And what I'm going to do is, with the zinnia, one of the things that I notice is that it is more intense on the petals closer towards the center of the flower. Different flowers are different. Some are very, some very greatly, they are actually quite dark on the edges. But the zinnia generally is lighter towards the outside, and it gets more intense. The color gets more intense as we go towards the middle. So I'm just going to go and do the big gestures like that with the petals, not fussing too much, but I am getting that general dark to light movement. I'm remembering as I do this, you'll notice I'm going back. I'm going to lift a little bit of that out because I know this is the lighted side here. I'm going to take a little bit of that out. That gives this edge a chance to dry. And then I'm going to come in with another. I'm going to try to keep that a little bit darker in here. We're going to come back in and probably put a shadow on there. There's a small petal here. I'm going to make that quite light. But I'm always thinking about where the light is as I go along. And just painting. Don't worry about getting it perfect. You're going to be surprised how things fall into place. And also have faith in, I used to work with a colleague and she had a fantastic way of referring to it. Keep yourself open to the artcident. It's not an accident, it's an artcident. Keep yourself open to that, because that's often where the magic happens. That thing that you're like, oh, I messed it up. And then if you keep plugging through and you keep moving along with your painting, you're going to find that it all falls together. And that thing, that one mistake, and I'm going to put that in quotes, that you thought you made, that artcident, that's actually the thing that really makes it shine. So don't scold yourself. Just keep painting. Yes, this is really quite beautiful. This one petal, you're going to notice I'm going to make it a little darker as I go down to a little more intense color. Might even go back to the pan for that. Drop that color down there. And then I'm going to bring this back up here. I might just add a little bit of pan color in here too, right from there, to keep that a little more intense in there, right around bring that up there too, right around the center of the flower, because we want that flower center to pop. I'm going to leave those little petals alone for right now. Again, I'm getting that, trying to capture that movement, that dark to light movement. And in this case, it's kind of at both ends of the petal, right? Because it actually gets a little bit darker because that petal's turning down. And I want to make sure that I do that, because you want to see the movement of the flowers. You know, plants are like people. They have posture. They have personality. They definitely do. And after years and years of drawing, that really being my favorite subject, I'm always amazed at how you can sort of see the different ways that they hold their petals, they hold their leaves. And you wanna capture that. And if something is, you can use artistic license. If something looks a little off or unbalanced, trust your eye, and you can change it in your drawing. There's no rule that says that you have to paint exactly what your teacher told you to paint, or that you have to paint exactly as you saw it. I think that's what you're doing when you're painting, is you're inviting. It's actually such a beautiful, it's such a beautiful act, drawing and painting, because you're actually inviting another human being into that vision of beauty that inspired you to take brush to the canvas or to the paper, or pencil to paper. It's just so nice, because sometimes visual art can be, it's not like music. Music can be sort of a shared experience, but there's something very personal sometimes about drawing and painting, and that's also part of what makes it really special too, I think, among the arts. So you'll notice that I left a few areas. Those are the zinnia has this wonderful way of curling up its petals just a little bit on the edges. So I'm focusing right now on just doing those graduated washes that capture that movement of dark to light. Overall, notice that this side of the flower is generally a little bit lighter, and I might even go back and make it lighter yet. Again, I'm using that brush as a sponge now, rather than rather than a mop. And you probably noticed I got it wet first because this has been drying for a little bit. It wasn't going to lift real easily. And I'm pulling a little bit out. And if I want to pull out even more, I can come back while it's wet, just very carefully, because you don't want to blot, a mess around, and pull out a little bit of that pigment. So now I'm going to come back in. I'm going to get these. I love them, but they're fiddly. These little petals that are up towards the center. I'm going to go ahead and put the more intense hues in first to capture those. And then I'll come back a little bit later, do a little lifting. Maybe, and a little, and then we're also going to come in here and we're going to put in a little bit of shadow too. Because it's not enough that we have a dark to light movement with the local color. We also have to bring some cools in there. Okay. And so this is where I'm going to do that. I'm going to take a little bit of my local color now, and my opposite of red, I know it sounds really scary, but it's green. So I'm going to actually take a little bit of green in there, and I'm going to blend that in right in there. But notice what I did. I made the local color darker and cooler. And that's exactly what you want to do. I didn't make it greener. Okay. So you can really see that. Oops, let me make sure I'm up here. So adding that green in, you can see that go in, but I'm making it darker and cooler. It is not greener. The moment it starts looking green, I'm going to take a little bit of that local color and I'm going to put that back in. I'm going to get a beautiful, rich, cooler version of my local hue. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to brush off just a little bit of water. And I'm going to come in here, and in these areas in here where I know there's a shadow, oh, look at that. Look, that's going to really start to pop now. And I'm going to bring the camera down so you can see how I'm starting to bring that color in. And it really begins to, you were probably wondering at some point, you're like, wait, how are these petals not just going to look like just a mishmash in here? And you can see this is how we're going to do it. Now, you probably noticed I left a bit of a hard edge in some of these areas. Not too worried about that right now, because I can come back in. And, for those of you who have been watching, you probably noticed I have not changed my brush. I'm going to do this whole zinnia with one brush. And then I'm going to come in. I'm actually taking out the pigment right now. And now what I'm doing is I like to call this back painting. I have a wet brush. I would call it a softly wet brush. It's not soppy, but I'm coming back in, and what I'm doing is again, this is a characteristic of the zinnia. They have these like little darker folds and veins and things, and I'm brushing back into that dark value, softening that dark value's edge, and at the same time, I'm getting that little bit, just a little bit of those lovely little folds that are in the flower. I'm going to come in and darken this area down here. And now I'm going to go back and using, again, that rich value that I made, that rich, cooler value, I'm going to put in the folds lighter. And if I want to create a little bit of contrast between them, I can come back with and I'll pull out just a bit so you can see how I'm changing my color around. Let me pull that out and shift up just a little. I want to make sure that you can see when I switch my colors, how I'm doing that. So I use the pure hue there. I'm going to take that with the tip of my brush and very gently pull that out. And that gives me a little bit more distinction there to capture, so people can see that little fold. Here's a petal that's turning down. On the other side, I'm going to use, again, that's my cool version that I'm using. I'm going to make it a little more intense up at the top, right? Because it's turning down and there's going to be a little bit of shadow up there. Pull that out just a little. And now we've got that nice curling under right in here. I'm going to, using my tip, just daub in some pigment there. Oh, this is the fun part. So I don't want to get too far. I'm starting to have fun, which means I have to stop right now. So what I'm going to...
I just have one quick question for you.
Sure.
And a couple others might pop up while you're answering this, but what are your recommendations about which values to start with, dark to light or vice versa?
Oh, now I think it kind of, so that's a great question, and that's going to give me an opportunity to switch off to one of the other paintings that I have here. So for example, with the vinca is characteristically, it has a very, very dark edge to the flower, and then the petal gets much, much later, almost goes to a pure white in the middle here. And so with the vinca, in this case, I would say the short answer to the question is it depends on the flower and it depends on what you're doing. So with the vinca, okay, I'm going to start with a really dark edge. And somebody was asking about, what do they do? And they do a really dark, look at that dark edge. I'm just going to put that in. Now I'm cleaning my brush completely and it's wet and I'm working it into that dark value. And like I said, I like to call this back painting. So I'm painting back into that dark value there. And then what I'm doing is I'm going to start to take that lighter value and I'm going to pull that down about halfway on that petal. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take just clean water and back paint into that. So I started dark there and went to light in order to get that movement of that petal. And in this case, here, this petal is actually bending down a little bit, so it's going to be even darker in this area, but I want to keep it soft. So this is actually quite wet, and I'll zoom that down so folks can see like just how wet that is. Like I really don't want to touch that because I can actually see, the little color bits of color here just kind of moving around, and then see I could get this lovely little fold in there. Now, so that I started from dark and then moved to light and then back painted that light movement into it. Now, in another case, in using the zinnia, and I'm going to not the zinnia, I'm sorry, we'll go back to the zinnia, but in using the Rose of Sharon, which is a really, really beautiful flower. And they're just coming into bloom now. Soon, I'm gonna take. Let me make sure. I want to make sure that you can see my palette, so you actually see how I'm moving from water to brush to paper towel. So I just activated that color for the Rose of Sharon, and now what I'm going to do here is, in this case, I'm actually rinsing out most of the color. I'm going to get it kind of heavy. I'm going to dip it. And now I'm going to really pull that off at the edge. And from here, even that's a little darker than I want to be. I'm going to come in, make this very light on the edge in here. And then what I'll do is I like to use sort of the physics here. It's very dark in here. I come in here and you can see, oh, wasn't that beautiful? I love it when it works like that for you. And it just swung around and met up with the rest of that. I'm going to come in here and I'm actually going to let that bleed just a bit into there. I might even make this even darker as I'm working along there. And back paint into that. This is dry, so I'm going to have to get the rest of that petal wet. And in this case, what I'm going to try to do, the Rose of Sharon has these beautiful wrinkles in it. So I'm going to let that dry just a bit. And now my brush is, I've taken almost all the water out of the brush right now. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to pull out that highlight right there. I'm also going to pull out another highlight up here if I can. This was dry from before. Might have to get this wet. The other thing that you will notice is that some pigments like to be lifted and other pigments do not. And again, you'll kind of find that through experience of which ones want to move and which ones don't. And there you go. So this one, I was starting from light and then moving into the dark and let them marry together. And then you get this beautiful, you can get this really beautiful movement from the dark to the lighter edges there. Or as we did with the Vinca, you can move from these dramatic edges into an almost completely white center with those. So
Mary Ellen, since you're currently at the Vinca, can I ask you one quick question about that?
Yep.
So this person wanted to know, how do you get that perfect purple color? Because their red and blue turn into like a muddier purple tone.
Oh, okay. The unfortunate, the true story is I have purple on my palette. So that is actually, I don't remember which this specific color is, but I encourage the person, I promise you, I will look it up. And if you email me, I will tell you what tube color that is. I will look that up. I don't have it handy right now. But when your reds or when your colors, the basic colors that you have that are mixing are not making the color that you need, then you need different primaries. Sometimes the best you can get, sometimes a red and a blue, that's all you can get from them. So for example, you'll notice that I have 3 reds here, and I use them all very, very differently for different applications. So this red here, this is a cadmium red light. This I would use for colors that are orange. I would say anything between yellow and red to make oranges. However, this is, I love to say the name of this. This is quincuncidine red. It's a fun mineral name. It took me a long time to learn how to say that correctly. So that is that's quincuncidine red, and this is actually an alizarin crimson in here. And so these reds I use when I'm moving toward purple. So a red isn't a red isn't a red. And the same is absolutely true of yellow. So one of my favorite yellows to use is this yellow here, which is called Naples yellow. And let me grab my scrap paper so you can see the difference between, this is Naples yellow here, okay? And then you can also, and then this is the cadmium yellow, and you know, both of them yellow, but this one much more of an earth tone, and this one a much more of what I like to refer to as a candy color. So it's a much, much brighter, much more vivid hue for that. And you can see where they would have very, very different applications. Were I to make a green, okay, I can make, you know, I can mix my yellow, and I can mix, and I generally, when I'm mixing to make greens, I'm going to use an ultramarine, and that's what I would use for purple too. I'm going to put in a little bit of ultramarine there and blend that, and that would make a lovely, put a little bit more in there, and I'm going to get a really nice green there. Okay, and that's with an ultramarine. However, notice if I were to do the same thing, but change the yellow, here's my, that's my Naples yellow, okay? And I'm gonna use the same blue. I'm gonna get a very, very different kind of green. It's gonna be a much earthier green, and a little bit closer to the brown side. Okay, and that's just a characteristic of those particular pigments. A very nice dark green. This would actually be a terrific shadow color. The one thing for shadows is that generally with shadows, they look beautiful when they're next to other colors, but you would never buy you know, you would never buy a shirt in a shadow color often. They colors interact when they're next to each other, and so sometimes they don't look very good when they're standing with that. So when getting back to the purple, if I mix this is my cadmium red with the ultramarine, okay, I'm gonna get a pretty nice purple there, okay. But if I take this is the quinconcidine, okay, I'm going to take that and say, again, I'll keep it the same blue, ultramarine. If you have one color on your palette, you want to have French ultramarine. It does everything. It's sort of, if you're into tools, it's the vice grips of pigments. It does everything.
Mary Ellen, as you're doing this, we have about 15 minutes left in the workshop, so I wanted to just alert you to that fact as you're working through the purples.
Okay, thank you. So the long answer is that different pigments mixed together, even in using your color theory. So obviously you're going to use blue and yellow to make green, red and blue to make purple, but depending on which pigments you actually have on your palette, you can get very, very different colors. So I hope that helps. And again, that's something that if you email me or if you go to my website, you can check out that I have a listing of palette colors there on my website. So to help you out if you do want to set up your own botanical palette. Okay. I also highly, highly recommend that if you can get a copy of and I mentioned this book on my website, Keith West's How to Draw and Paint Wildflowers. He does a very, very long and fascinating explanation and recommendation of colors that you should have on your botanical palette. So, so hopefully those will be sources that will help you. So let's get back to our zinnia. We only have one flower painted, and I definitely want to get on to leaves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to very, very quickly move through our second flower. We kind of talked through the first one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to just sort of watch and paint along with me. Okay, as I do this second flower, you're going to notice I'm starting out again, same way, starting with that light to dark. Okay, I'm keeping it quite light on the far side. Remember, things that are further away from us tend to be a lot, they don't have as vivid color. They tend to be paler in general, and their colors are not as intense. So we want to make sure that we capture that in our painting. Okay, so if there was an accident and I turned it into a dark value, I remember the first time I was doing an internship, and I was marveling at my supervisor's printing. And I said to her, I like, how do you print so perfectly every single time? How do you get it right? And she goes, I don't. She goes, I just know what to do with the mistakes. And I thought that that was just such a great answer. And I realized, because, you know, we put ourselves under this pressure to, oh, it's got to be perfect. We got to get it absolutely right. And that's not life. Life is knowing what to do when you've got a mess on your hands. It's a lot like painting. And so I'm going to, as I said, I'm moving a little quickly here. And also too, I did want to mention, as I'm painting, that I have a time lapse of me painting the zinnias. And I think it might be helpful to those of you who are kind of wondering, like, what do I do first? Because what I was fascinated by this, in doing it, I noticed that was the sort of takeaway for me in watching myself work was, oh, I did that first, and I did that second, and I did that third. And that can be super, super helpful when you're learning how to get started with the painting. I'm going to start to bring in some of those darker colors here, make that a little more intense in here. Pull those out. As I said, watercolor can be a hurry up and wait kind of medium, and sometimes painting too slowly can actually be problematic. I'm going to back paint to soften that into there like that. I'm going to come around. I've got enough residue on my brush and on the rest of the painting. I can put a little bit of value on those far petals. I'm coming in with a fairly clean brush right now and back painting into that. And I'm actually going to purposefully rough up this edge here, because I know what the interior of the zinnia is like, and that little interior is not like a flat disc. It's got all these lovely little florets that are all sort of ruffled at the top. And so I want to make sure that that sort of ruffled sense of all the little pistils and stamen that are in the center of the flower there, that characteristic is there and there. So now we have our two flowers. And because this is very wet right now, we're going to leave that alone, and we're going to move on to our petals. Now, one of the things that in a discussion of petals, I'm sorry, not petals, leaves, forgive me. In looking at the leaves, again, we're going to start with that local color. I want you to notice something that I did. My local color for my leaves is actually the same green that I used to get the darker value in the petals. I really recommend doing that. It creates a kind of palette unity in your painting that I think is difficult to achieve. So you end up using a rather limited number of colors. Right now, believe it or not, this entire painting is only 2 colors right now. And the only thing, and what I'm adding on here is actually that second color. And this is the color that I was putting in for, to create that dark value. And with the leaf and the stem, just again, just putting in local color, I'm going to come in and put in the darker values later. But I am going to pull out some of the highlights because our zinnia leaf actually has these it has deep, dark veins in it. This is the darker side of the leaf. So you noticed I did a little wet into wet there to get that movement. And I'm trying to avoid my highlights a little bit there. And I'm going to pull that out to a nice little tip there. So I'm going to let that dry. Okay, I'm not going to fuss with it. I'm going to come over here to this leaf. I move down here. Do exactly the same thing. Put that in. Also, too, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to back paint that stem to fade it, because it's very nice to have things fade towards the edge. If you keep it solid all the way to the very edge of your painting, it has a tendency to make it look like it was unintentional that way, that you want to make it look like you intended to make the painting end there, to make it run out. If it goes all the way like a hard line right to the end, it has that look like, oops, I didn't mean that. I wished my canvas was a little bigger. So you want to avoid that. Notice again, I've got the lighted side and the darker side, getting that movement in there right away. That's one of the first things we're going to do. So we have that sort of value structure is there already in the painting. Now I'm going to go up and I'm going to do the bud. And the bud, for this circumstance, I'm actually going to add a little bit of the yellow to lighten it up, because this is a bud and we're going to get just a little more of a spring green. Notice I'm
Mary Ellen, can you tilt the camera up just a little bit so we can see that? Pull your palette down. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. And you'll notice I'm using the tip of my brush. Notice I've changed my posture of the brush in my hand just a little bit in order to get those lovely little sharp tips. I'm going to come back in, and once again, while it's wet, I'm going to pull out just a little. And oh, look at that. That's so nice. Getting that nice dark to light movement. And I'm going to come in with the local color here, darken down right where there is that turning shadow area. Because remember, we always imagine, it as the simplest structure. We can even have a little fun here if you want. This is where it's kind of nice, like, oh, maybe it's just starting to open. Maybe just a little bit. Oh, look at that. That gives it a little bit of life there, like that. Oh, it's so easy to fall in love in the details, but you have to save the details just a little bit till you get all your structure in. Gonna add that little bit of stem in there. Don't want to forget about it.
Mary Ellen, as you're working on this, I just want to let you know we are just about at 1 o'clock. But if you're willing to stay another couple minutes to maybe keep working and answer a couple questions,
sure.
And we could do that. But continue, please continue.
Well, what I will do is with that, because we do have our final product right there for people to see, and this is posted on my website. I will take the last few minutes just to talk about leaves just a little bit, because they tend to be something that stymies folks. You always want to make sure you get that dark to light movement on the leaf itself. And then, as I said, Notice that, oh, that's a little dark. I'm going to come back. I'm going to pull some of that out. Oh, that worked out okay. I'll pull a little bit of that out there. Oops, going the wrong direction. There we go. And we're going to get just a little bit of vein, of the dark veins into that leaf form. Now, the vinca leaf is different. And that's why I wanted to make sure that I showed folks the vinca leaf. I'm going to come in with a darker green. Notice that I did the whole leaf already with the light to dark movement in one solid color. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in with that darker color, and I'm going to leave the veins. Now it's okay if you lose a little bit of the line. Notice that I lost a little bit of it there. And I'm going to keep that main line in there. And you can see how I'm letting that underpainting show through by putting the darker value, layering that on top. So I think that wraps up all of our skills that we have there. And if anybody has any questions, I would love to answer them. I think I'm gonna.
So we do have one question here. We have a couple actually, but this person said they keep getting bubbles, and how do they fix it?
Bubbles in their painting? They're probably swishing their brush a little too aggressively and getting bubbles in the brush. So probably just a little more, not like you're frothing a cappuccino, but you want to just sort of swish it around, and then I think wiping it off on the rim of your cup would probably help eliminate the bubbles.
Fantastic. And then what are your recommendations about which values to start with? I'm sorry, you already answered that question. Apologies. This question was, please talk about when and how you add background colors or wash to a subject.
Oh, that's a really good question. And actually, some of that is, again, addressed on my website. There's a couple of things that you can do. You can generally, what I do is if I'm not going to have a pure white background, I generally put the background in first, and I very carefully paint around my, I paint around my painting, my underdrawing, I should say. However, I have come in afterward when the painting is completely dried and very, very carefully come in and put in a background with it. Generally with backgrounds, you want to have a light to dark movement from the upper left-hand corner being the lightest to being a little bit darker in the lower right-hand corner. So you have this kind of diagonal movement across the canvas. But I would say that the other thing that you can do is there is a fluid called masking fluid. And what you actually do, I only use it on rare occasions, but what you actually can do is you can paint in every place that you're going to put color. You actually paint over it with masking fluid. Then you can paint your background with abandon. You don't need to worry about ruining any of the white paper. Then once the background is completely dry, you actually come in with your finger and you roll it off, similar to rubber cement. I'm not a fan of masking fluid just because for me, I feel like sometimes it changes the texture of the paper ever so slightly. But Winsor Newton makes a very good masking fluid, and it's very, very easy to use. My only caveat with all of that is that make sure you use a junk brush with it. Your brush will not be usable for painting afterward. So you can just kind of keep that around and have that brush as your masking brush. So does that answer that question?
I think so. And just one more question here. What about the centers of the zinnias?
Oh, well, for the centers of the zinnias, I can do that really quickly. Absolutely. I was so focused on making sure we got to leaves. I forgot about our little centers. Let's do that real quick. I've got my yellow here. Okay. And I think everybody can see. There we go. Okay. I'm going to come in with the yellow, and I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to paint. And as I mentioned, I'm going to keep that little rough edge. I'm going to paint this a solid yellow, okay, all the way through. And I'm going to come back with my brush. I'm going to lift out that top disc portion, lighten it up significantly. Okay. You're going to see that yet. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in with an orange that is made with the color of the zinnia and the cadmium yellow. And I'm going to come in, and while that's wet, with the tip of my brush, I'm going to drop a little bit of that orange color into there. And I'm going to let that, I'm just going to let that bloom in the wet portion there. Probably give a little bit, notice I'm trying to create, there's a little bit, the center of the zinnia actually stands up a little bit like a cupcake. And so this is kind of the side of the cupcake. And then I have my highlight, and then it actually has a little indentation in the top of the cupcake, and I tried to capture that. And there we go. No fuss, no muss. And I'll do the same thing on.
Mary Ellen, can you move slightly to the right or down? Yeah, so we can see what you're working on.
This one. I'll do that one really quickly too. Same thing. I'm going to pull out that top, get a nice highlight in there. I know the cadmium yellow will pull out almost to a white. And then I'm going to take that orange again and touch that on the side there and just up in the center. And we've got the center of our flower. And you can see here on the finished one here, they're slightly different, the things, but you can see here where I actually went in with the tip of the brush and pulled out even a few lines in there. And I don't worry about, if part of it bleeds into the other, that's just part of the uniqueness of the flower.
Thanks so much for attending today, to everybody. If you're local, we do encourage you to come visit us at the Botanic Garden, bring your watercolors, and so we are open indoors and out, but we have some lovely summer flowers that are starting to bloom, so come visit, paint, share out what you've painted with us, maybe snap a photo of yourself there painting and share it out using the hashtag USBGArt. If you're not local, still get outside and paint some amazing summer flowers wherever you are, and also share those with us, those paintings and those flowers that you're inspired by. But really want to thank you, Mary Ellen. This has been a fantastic class, and thanks to everybody who's joined us today.